The Lord is in this place. And Dr. Loudermilk just gave us a wonderful sermon. I think I can just go and sit down now. I think what a wonderful. I want to thank Jeremy, the director of this campus and this beautiful campus here in West Palm in Orlando. And my friend Eric Loudermilk, thank you for that very hearty introduction. It's good that you are here, and it's good that I had a driver today. I needed a driver today. I worked a lot of hours yesterday and last night. So I began early teaching a class in Church and Society. I left that class and taught a class in urban justice issues. I left that class and taught preaching to MDiv students. I left that class and ended the night teaching spiritual formation to a mixture of day and evening undergraduate students. So when I got home, my wife said, "Do you know your address?" We are delighted to be having been invited to share with you today, and thank you. Thank you for the lunch, Jeremy. It was delicious. Thank you, sir. I grew up in the Midwest, small town called Oxford, Ohio. It's about 50 miles from Cincinnati, Ohio. It's noted for its university. It is Miami University of Ohio. It was a university before Miami was, and Florida was a state. That's how old this university was. It was a very interesting community because, as was mentioned earlier by Dr. Loudermilk, that sometimes when you're in a situation, you don't realize the cultural context until you come out of that situation. We were in a small town where everybody got along, but it was kind of a cosmopolitan because it was a university there. Therefore, there was a great deal of interracial connecting. There were international students on campus. But the thing that I noticed that on Sunday morning, there was a clear distinction between the races. The Black Baptists went to the Black Baptist churches. The white Baptists went to their churches. The Methodists, white and black, segregated. The Pentecostals, even with their heightened emotion, there was a white Pentecostal and a black Pentecostal church. And I thought, God cannot be pleased with our separating within the family. And I wrote a book about separation of Christian worshipers and how that we were stubborn in that area. But the Bible teaches, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, which means then that we're not looking for some segregated heaven stuff going on. We're looking for a united, a family, the community of God. Recently, it has brought to my attention the events that have been going around the United States. Unfortunately, this weekend I have been troubled by an event that took place just outside of West Palm, just north in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. A young man, 31 years old, who played the drums at his local Church of God in Delray Beach, Florida. He was using his talents at a club playing Saturday night, and it was late. He decided to go home. His car broke down near a bridge coming off getting ready to get on 95. The next thing that we understand is that he was fatally shot by a plainclothes policeman. We don't know what the details are of this fatality, and I think we should approach with a very reasoned and civil mindedness. But we do know that the young man was a young man who was very active in his church. He was nothing but of good character according to those who know him and knew him. And so there is a level of concern. Dr. King talked about violence. And he talked about the fact that there are no winners in a violent world. We all lose. It makes no difference what color we are. We all lose. And I couldn't help but think about the relationship between Dr. King. I hear a lot of voices now, but I'm not hearing a lot of voices that are talking about the message that Dr. King so clearly and articulate in his discussion of peace and nonviolence. I'm not hearing King's voice, and all the voices I'm hearing today, I'm hearing a lot of voices, but I want to hear Dr. King's voice because his voice had a message based upon the Christian idea of love. And so I thought I'd go back in order to bring us here, go back in history to bring us here to our current situation. The question, of course, is what happened in Ferguson? What happened in Ferguson? And I think that sometimes when we talk about Ferguson or Baltimore or New York, we only talk about the surface issues. We know Michael Brown was an unarmed black teenager who was shot and killed August 9th, 2014. He was shot by a police officer by the name of Darren Wilson. He was a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Ferguson, Missouri is a suburb of the state of Missouri. And I thought about this and I said, wait, okay, so there's a black man that's shot by a white police officer. There are black men who shoot other black men. There are white men who shoot white men. There's got to be more to the story. In March, the Justice Department called Ferguson and said that we need to overhaul the criminal justice system. Now we have a problem. If we have to overhaul a criminal justice system, it's not just about black killing black, white killing white, white killing black, black killing white, but there is the acknowledgement that justice is not being realized. That's a problem. And the declaration that was made is that the city had engaged in constitutional violations. Constitutional violations. Of course, we know a wave of anger broke out after Ferguson. And St. Louis County, the grand jury had brought criminal charges against Darren Wilson, the white police officer. But the decision by the grand jury of 9 whites and 3 blacks was announced that Monday at a news conference packed with reporters from around the world, and they talked about the killing on this residential street in Ferguson, which set off weeks of civil unrest. And it was fueled by protesters who were outraged over what they called a pattern of police brutality against young black men. The interesting thing again is not just that it is the killing of a black man who was in the back of a police van and was shaken, but someone says that there could have been some violence done to him. But it's not just that. It is the question of justice in a system that has been accused of being unjust. So Wilson had faced charges and of first-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and was found not guilty. That's not the problem. The problem is deeper than that. When people say Black Lives Matter, it's not an indictment against the white race as a whole. When people say Black Lives Matter, they're not saying that white people are guilty of killing black people. They're saying that whether it's black on black crime, whether it's police brutality, whether it is something else, there is a tremendous number of young men from the age of 15 to 25 who are not living beyond their 25th birthday, and they are black. That's why Black Lives Matter. Someone said to me, that's divisive. If you say black lives, don't all lives? Yes, they matter. But when we talk about anti-abortion movement, we say the unborn lives of babies matter. And someone says, well, don't all people matter? Yes, but if there are thousands of abortions, we are specific to say the unborn child matters, just as all lives matters. Does that make sense? So what happened in Ferguson? Dr. King wrote about the role of violence in America and the role of injustice. Dr. King had gone to Birmingham, Alabama in the early 60s. And the reason he went to Birmingham is because he knew that old Bull Connor, that police director, that man would raise some cane because of the protest of those leaders of the civil rights movement. In fact, Dr. King had been invited there by a good friend of mine by the name of Fred Shuttlesworth. Some of you have heard of that name. Fred Shuttlesworth had already been in Birmingham leading a human rights organization. And he had already begun to really bother Bull Connor. Bull Connor did not have much good to say about Fred Shuttlesworth. The only problem is nobody would hear Fred. Fred had had his house bombed. Fred had had his wife beaten. Fred had been jailed, locked up many times, but nobody would hear Fred. So Fred calls Dr. King and says, Martin, come to Birmingham, and I guarantee you that Bull Connor will bring some attention to Birmingham. And sure enough, when Dr. King arrived in Birmingham, Bull Connor, in his typical fashion, decided to go after the protesters. The difference between Birmingham protesters and Ferguson protesters was that King said, we are leading a peaceful protest. The model is that when you lead a peaceful protest, then you are standing on the virtues of justice. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Someone says, okay, but we're mad. Yes, we all get mad. But King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, which means stand on the principle of justice, and justice will speak and stand for itself. You do right and let justice manifest itself. What happened in Baltimore? Baltimore, Maryland. A young boy, Gray, Mr. Gray, 25 years old, died while in police custody. Some say it was a racially prejudiced act by Baltimore policemen, and continues to torment that city. And I'll say something later about the numbers in this particular city. The data shows about the racial makeup in Baltimore, particularly among Baltimore's finest. We called them the police. Of the 2,745 active duty police officers in the department, 1,445, more than half, are African American. Hispanic, they're Asian or Native Americans, according to the data. 4 of the top 6 commanders are either African American or Hispanic in Baltimore. More than 60% of the incumbents of the highest command levels hail from minority communities in Baltimore. Among the 46 Baltimore police officers who hold the rank of captain or above, 25 are from ethnic racial minority groups. That constitutes 54% of the command leadership are people of color in Baltimore. In other words, Baltimore is a black majority-led city of policemen whose officers are mostly racial minorities as well. Interesting. Officers have been charged with multiple offenses, including murder and manslaughter, and the Department of Justice is conducting pattern and practices investigations of allegations of racial discrimination in the city's police department. A police department that's 54% African American or ethnic minority. Something's wrong with that picture. It's not about race, it's about injustice. And injustice can come in any color. There is black corrupt cops and there are white corrupt cops. Did you know that the trial of those who were accused in the Gray death were also people of color arrested in Baltimore? I step back for just a minute to just say we've got to think about what's being done through our protest. MLK was a student of history. King's critique of the early 20th century, he looked at black leadership. He looked at leaders like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. He looked at Marcus Garvey. He looked at various leaders within Black America, and he was able to grasp an appreciation for the King contributions of these leaders. But he also did something else. He saw the strengths and he saw the weaknesses of their approaches and the various methods to gain social reform. And I think we ought to think about some of the approaches that are being manifested in the lives of people, change makers today. As King said, social change and the methods must be suited to the circumstances of the period. So I suggest to you, and I do in my book, that prophetically King envisioned a post-racial society. A post-racial society. King did not propose that we do away with race. Race is something we acknowledge. I'm a little concerned when somebody says, I want a colorblind society. Because I don't want a colorblind car. I got a red car and I know it's red. You got a blue car, you know it's blue. Why do you want to be colorblind so you can't tell what color your car is? God did not make us the same. What a diverse, what a wonderful God, what a canvas of diversity and color God has made us. I'm so thankful. I tell people all the time, and in my class they say, well, what do you mean you're black and I'm white? Yeah, no, I'm caramel. I'm the caramel brother, right? I've got some yellow and I've got some brown and I've got some white brothers in my family. But we're all brothers. Colorblind. That's kind of a way of saying, well, I won't have to deal with race. No. We have to get to a post-racial society where people are not defined, as Dr. Lattimore mentioned, people are not defined by their race. They're not stereotyped to be either inadequate, insufficient, or incapable of competing in society. Michael O. Emerson and Christian Smith wrote a book called Divided by Faith: Evangelical Religion and the Problem of Race in America. And they wrote, when we speak of a racialized society, we mean primarily the black-white divide. Or, in some cases, the black non-black divide. King had an approach, and I just want to talk about King's approach to social change. He believed that there was a three-pronged approach that first must be addressed. One has to do with political protest and mass demonstrations. Political protest and mass demonstrations. In the words of Jesus, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called God's children," could not be more relevant to this kind of 20th century prophetic word of King. For King's earliest work took place in the South. It later went to the north. Baltimore is a good example, but he went to Chicago. Can you imagine? He left the South to go north to Chicago. People have expectations that in the North, things in the North are a lot different than things in the South. That was the expectation. The expectation is things can't be bad because we know they're bad in Mississippi. We know they got Mississippi burning, right? We know they are bad in Mississippi. But really, Chicago? And King made his way to Chicago and discovered that the hate was more profound in Chicago than anything he experienced in the South. The reason is that there was a kind of discrimination that does not necessarily voice itself openly until it is challenged in terms of change. The South had always been segregated, right? Remember? The South was black South, it was white South. But in North there was this attempt to integrate. And that's where the problem came. And I'm remembering pictures of Dr. King marching through Chicago and bodyguards around him and him covering as gunshots are ringing out. And when Dr. King got on the helicopter and they were flying around and someone asked King, they said, "King, were you nervous?" He said, "Well, I can tell you I did this." He said we had to ask a prayer. We led a prayer. And he said, but I prayed with my eyes open. Because the Bible said, watch as well as pray, right? But he marched, he protested peacefully. It was peaceful protest. He was enveloped in the fierce violence of bombings and brutal beatings. His message of peace, however, remained intact. In the midst of the attacks, his nonviolent posture remained intact. Oh, America could learn something today from the methods of King. Training and education of our youth is another approach King often highlighted. We must constantly stimulate our youth to rise above the stagnant level of mediocrity. We must help them to achieve excellence in various fields. Doors are opening now, King said, They were not open in the past, and the great challenge facing minority groups is to be ready to enter these doors as they open. No great or greater tragedy could befall us at this hour but that of allowing new opportunities to emerge without the preparedness to meet them. And then King, before he was with us, his last mission, his last effort was the Poor People's Campaign. King said, "This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The question is whether America will do it. There is nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques," he said, "and the resources to get rid of poverty. The question," Dr. King said, "is whether or not we have the will." Some of my evangelical friends say, "Well, that sounds like a socialist message." But when you see economic structure that's based upon discrimination and the lack of opportunity due to race, it's not about socialism, it's about justice. From the beginning, a basic philosophy guided the movement. This principle has been referred to variously or in various occasions as non-violent resistance, non-cooperation, and passive resistance. But the first days of the protest, none of these expressions was mentioned. I hear people talk about Ferguson. I hear people talk about Baltimore. But I'm not hearing a lot about the phrase most often used by Dr. King, Christian love. Admittedly, nonviolence in the truest sense is not a strategy that one uses simply because it is expedient. It is a way of life. Nonviolence must become a way of life. And I think that speaks to it all. Let me say a few more things. That's what we good preachers do. We say, I'm not gonna hold you long. Then you go for another hour. I'm not gonna hold you long. Nonviolence, the way of life that men and women should live by, because the sheer morality of its claim. Also, the basic fact that characterizes nonviolence is that it does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his or her friendship and understanding. Third point concerns nonviolent resistance is that it avoids not only external physical violence, but also internal violence of the spirit. Internal violence of the spirit. The nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, but he also refuses to hate him. Fifth, the fact about nonviolence resistance is that it is based on the conviction that the universe is not on the side of justice. Consequently, the believer in nonviolence has deep faith in the future. You've got to have faith in the future. And so Dr. King did not hesitate to call his movement an army. And what would it mean in America today if we had an army of not just blacks, but whites, of Asians, of Hispanics, to gather around the table of brotherhood saying, we want the same thing, we want justice. And so, my dear brothers and sisters, I thank for you preachers in the room. This is the age of prophetic preaching. Can I get an amen? Ezekiel 2:5 says, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been amongst them. Are you willing to preach so that even if people don't like what you say, they will know that God has spoken? What I would say is what King said. I quote, King said, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their thus saith the Lord far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarshish and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to that Macedonian call for aid. We need prophets of justice. Comfort, oh comfort my people, the prophet Isaiah says. Comfort my people, speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that she served her term. Her penalty is paid. Isaiah 41:2. Prophetic preaching will have to reach deeper than the culpability of those who are victims of oppression themselves, and probe the political order that protects and perpetuates the status quo. We need prophets to proclaim the word of the Lord now and in this present crisis, to undo this awful state of affairs. I need to say something about King and this social demonstration. Let me move this slide real quick. Prophetic preaching. Let me say something about Ferguson. I want you to look at some numbers here with me. The population in Missouri, 6,021,000 in Ferguson. Look at the white population in Ferguson and look at the black population in Ferguson. %29 white, 27 black. High school graduation level is fairly consistent between Ferguson and Missouri as a whole. Bachelor's degree, fairly consistent. So what's going on in this dynamic? Ferguson, 58 home ownership, fairly consistent, 68 for Missourians, white or black. But look at housing and look at median house, slight difference, not much. I don't see large gaps, do you? I mean, am I missing something? I'm trying to look, just the facts, the numbers, looking at numbers. Baltimore, more importantly, total population of Maryland in the city of Baltimore. White alone, 31.6% population. Black African American, 63%. That's a majority of the population in Baltimore. Bachelor's degree or higher, 26%. Still low, 36. Home ownership. Well, Maryland general, black in Baltimore, the majority in Baltimore. But look at the disparity between housing units as well as a little bit more distance in income levels. Why is this important? Because if we're going to address injustice, we need to be sure we understand where the injustice is. I'm becoming more convinced that evil is often been ascribed to the wrong source. Evil is satanic, and as long as the enemy can keep us divided over minute, insignificant differences, the enemy will continue to exploit us. Our real enemy is not each other. Our enemy is the devil. It is the demonic spirit that says we are not alike. Really? Dr. Proctor was my professor in seminary, my MDiv work at United Theological Seminary. His name is Samuel DeWitt Proctor. He was the pastor for many years at Abyssinia Baptist Church in Harlem, New York. He followed Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. You know the class of Adam Clayton Powell, who worked as an activist in the Congress for many years. And when Samuel DeWitt Proctor came to Abyssinia, a 10,000 membership church in the heart of Harlem, it was the prestigious black church, quote unquote. But it was so significant because it was the church that Dietrich Bonhoeffer decided that when he was working on his PhD, on his MDiv degree at Union Theological Seminary, he became friends with a gentleman by the name of Frank Fisher. Frank Fisher was an African American who was a member of Abyssinia Baptist Church. And Frank said to Bonhoeffer, "Come to church with me." And Bonhoeffer said, "Yeah, sure." This Lutheran, he's a German Lutheran. This white German Lutheran said, "I'll go to church with you." He came to Abyssinia, and they were rocking, and the Lord is good, right? They were enjoying their spiritual worship. And Bonhoeffer comes in, and Bonhoeffer enjoys it so much. You know what Bonhoeffer said? He said, I've never had such a spiritual experience like I had at Abyssinia Baptist Church. He became so enthralled, so fascinated by African American experience, he began to come back to church. And he not only came back to church, he decided to go to all of the African cultural libraries to learn as much as he could about African American life in America. He even talked his friend Frank Fisher into giving him a ride through the South, because he wanted to see how African Americans lived through the Deep South. So he went through Mississippi, he went through all those southern states looking at the conditions of poor blacks. And then he was invited to go back to Germany to help free his people from the fascism of Hitler. And while many of them thought that his going back had to do with the Lutheran Church siding with Hitler, he said, no, we've got to protect those poor Jews that are so oppressed. And somehow he thought back in his mind, I saw what poor people look like. I saw what injustice looks like. I saw what poverty looks like. I was in the South and I didn't like it. So we must remove Hitler from his position as the ranker in Germany. The enemy is not each of us. The enemy is Satan. And if he can keep us divided, he will. God bless you. And God keep you.